Greetings, Bill Mobley for the Sanford Institute for Empathy and Compassion, and together with my co-host, Naila Chowdhury, who is Director of Social Impact and Innovation at UCSD Extension, we're really very pleased to have three guests with us on this segment. Like our other guests, these people have dedicated their lives to serving others, to do so in difficult situations like the one we're facing right now with the pandemic. And through their work and through their actions and through the support they give to others, they're really bringing hope where there is very little hope. And so we're very thankful that they're with us today. And Naila, I wonder if you'll go ahead and introduce our guests one by one.
Thank you, Dr. Mobley. Today's guests are all together for a calling and purpose in life which brought them together, love for humanity. And they're all frontline workers. And I would like to introduce Andrew Foley, who's actually a cybersecurity expert, but he's been in Moria camp from 2015 onwards. And he co-founded Better Days over there and currently working on several fronts to try to prepare the camp and the island for inevitable outbreak of the pandemic there. Then Annie Chapman, who's a doctor by profession. She works in London Hospital and she worked in Moria camp. That is the link between three of them over there. She was actually able to leverage her connection to help get the public eye turned towards the Moria camp. And I have read her chilling article, A Doctor's Story Inside the Living Hell of Moria Refugee Camp. Then it's Gabriel Feldman, who has been a great friend to bring everybody together. He's an architect by profession who shifted to aid work from 2016, and he volunteered for Better Days. And from there on, he's worked with Annie in Moria camp in the medical clinic. And here they are together with us today, and we are honored and humbled to have all of you here. Let's hear from all of you, your life's journey. So we'll start off with Andrew, then Annie, and then Gabriel. Welcome.
Yeah, hi, thank you very much for having me on the show. My story began in Lesbos in 2016, February 2016. Before that, I worked in data security for many years. I worked in Dublin, I worked in Los Angeles, I worked in Australia. And I had come home actually from the US and had seen what was happening on the news, something I was not aware of. And this was the refugee crisis in Greece, with millions of people arriving, or on Lesbos we had 800,000 people arrive. And I decided that I'd go and volunteer for 3 weeks. I booked a plane ticket and then a ferry ticket from Athens to Lesbos. I came in February and I started volunteering in Moria camp. And from there, it's grown to what it is today. I've been here for 4 years now. I founded Better Days. We're an actor that provides services for unaccompanied children. We began as an emergency responder in 2016, 2015, 2016. And then as the kind of crisis here matured, we moved into service provision and focusing on unaccompanied children. So we have a school here where we educate 200 children a day. We also provide legal services for those children, focusing on family reunification for unaccompanied children who are here in Greece. And we also provide protection services for unaccompanied children. And they're obviously incredibly vulnerable. They have, experienced incredibly traumatic scenes, and they've been witnesses to some of, to terrible wars. So there's a lot of trauma that they have to contend with. We provide those services and then try and get them reunified with their family. Or if that's not an option, provide, really high quality education and a safe space for them to come into every day. Unfortunately, a lot of the children who we work with do live in the camps, and the majority of whom live in the camps. There are other unaccompanied children who live in alternate accommodation sites, so in different apartments. But at the moment, we have over 900 unaccompanied children in this camp, many of whom are homeless, living in the olive groves around the camp. And they have very little access to any services or even anyone to listen to, their story or understand what their needs are. So my organization, we have, an incredible group of team of people, before the virus came, and a lot of our services were reduced. We had 30 people working every day to provide these services, both in the camp and then for our school outside the camp. So that's what we focus on.
Thank you. We'll move on to Annie.
Hi, yes, thank you. Thank you very much for having me, and thank you to Gabriel for bringing us together. So I'm an emergency doctor from England, trained in the north in Manchester, and then work in London now. And I've done emergency medicine, so I'm doing emergency medicine as a specialty. And been interested for a long time in emergency and also expedition medicine. And then in 2016, I had a friend who was working for a search and rescue organisation who asked me to go over as a medic to Lesbos as the crisis, sounds like probably similar time to when Andrew first went, as the crisis was kind of starting to hot up and beginning to unfold. And just went for a couple of weeks. Was really struck by what was happening there. And then had some time at the end of last year and beginning of this year. So went back to work with Moria Refugee Foundation, who are a Dutch medical organisation in the camp. And they run the emergency, or did kind of pre-pandemic, run the emergency clinic and services in Moria. So my role there was as an emergency doctor. We were dealing with lots of, initially when I went, more kind of primary care problems, looking at, kind of relative to global health problems, and also then looking at the social problems within the camp from a health perspective, which had challenges in itself because we're quite, a group of volunteers and transient, but very, very interesting to work with people from all around the world. And the situation had changed when I came back in January of this year, as the conditions in the camp had worsened, the hopelessness had worsened, in my opinion. The kind of the progression of people living in the camp was slower, and the situation was more desperate, and we kind of ramped up, saw a lot more violence, and outbreaks of things like meningitis. So I think actually working as an emergency doctor and having emergency experience was really useful for that. And it was a real kind of life-changing experience. I think both the work itself, meeting the people in the camp, but also meeting the other volunteers. So I feel very, very lucky to be involved in it, and I've definitely left a big part of my heart in Lesbos, and can see the pull of staying there, as Andrew has. So yes, I'm very grateful for you to for giving me the platform to speak today. Thank you.
Gabriel.
Gabriel, again, also thanks so much for having us on this. It's a really, really intriguing concept, this whole show. So my background, as mentioned, was I'm an architect. I worked in New York for it's been almost 8 years now. Mostly just sort of your standard corporate interior stuff. In 2016, I started taking my vacation and going on sort of volunteer trips. I went to Zambia in 2016, and then in 2017, I actually went and volunteered with Andrew's organization, Better Days, for I think it was 2 weeks, maybe 3 weeks. I had a general sense of sort of what was happening in as far as the refugee crisis, but it was very detached. Unfortunately, in the States, there isn't too much media on it. There definitely wasn't then. There was a little bit of a spike, but it's sort of plateaued as now as well. But so when I was there, I think like for all three of us, it hits pretty hard when you start to see the disparity. I actually, that in 2017, I don't think at that point we were allowed in the camp, or at least I hadn't been inside Moria, but you still, interacting with people outside, you can't help but just feel the desperation and the frustration. So that motivated me sort of from then to start to change the trajectory of my quote unquote career, to try and move towards doing more for vulnerable populations, just because it became evident that there's a lot to do. So I may as well get started as soon as possible. And working with people like Andrew was kind of very, very inspiring. When I was there in 2017, I was actually there with my father. And we were, Andrew, I don't know if you remember this, but we were following you to, I don't know, we were going to pick up supplies or something, or grab tents, and you were on your well, not so little, your motorcycle, and we were following with the little rent-a-car. And I remember looking at my dad and saying, and like pointing to you ahead of us, and I was like, I can do that. I can be essentially, you know, my talents are far different, and the skills are, I would say, a little bit more limited, but I can do that. I have been given a great amount of privilege, and I can leverage that. I can use that to do something like what Andrew's doing. So I've kind of, from then, it's taken a little bit of time to get to a point where I can actually start, but going in this most recent time was the sort of trial run for it. And it was, like Annie said, it was far more overwhelming, just because for me it was the first, I was there for 3 months, and we were inside the camp. So it was incredibly overwhelming at first, and then it sort of gets normalized, which is a little bit weird. And then after it becomes normal, it becomes a little bit easier to start to look at things from a large macro scale, and try and understand where you can fit in to actually make a difference. Similar to how Andrew and his organization have just, they've filled a niche that it's such a vulnerable population. The unaccompanied children it's like the other than perhaps maybe the elderly, which sort of are getting a focus now because of COVID, it's possibly the most vulnerable group I have ever interacted with in my life.
So you guys have had such an interesting set of experiences. So if I summarize the themes that I've heard, it's 3 people who come from a very privileged background, who've been well educated, had strong family lives, who've done things, who've accomplished something in their careers, who volunteered to deal with despair, to deal with inequality, to deal with suffering. In the process, each of them have kind of evolved their roles. Yes, they've built upon what they learned in school and through professions, but they've evolved their roles. They've changed those roles over time. And then here's this new status quo. Andrew was just speaking about it. Here's a new status quo. Okay, we're here, we're dealing with this. We can sort of see problems and for what they are. Maybe we can make a difference. And then suddenly, and maybe not so suddenly, there's a new problem. So the old status quo is bad enough. Now there's a new status quo that's worse. So maybe let me go back. Let's talk with each other now about, again, starting with Gabe, let's start with where you see this going for yourself and for those you serve. And what gaps do you see? How can the world make this better in front of your own eyes? Gabriel, what do you think?
It's a big task. I think for the thing that I've noticed, at least for my sort of group, or sort of, you know, my people, let's say, the biggest thing, or the biggest gap that I have found, is just general knowledge. I think for the most part, people do care. I think fear limits that sometimes, and it makes it, you sort of focus in a little bit more. But I think in general, when people are not fearful for their own safety, they do look outward and want to help. So I think the biggest thing is just knowledge, just getting, so things like this are some of the most powerful ways to try and spread care, if that makes any sense, just because a good example is, I'm tangenting a little bit here, but sort of during this whole COVID thing, I was volunteering before this with meal drop-offs and soup kitchens and stuff randomly, sort of when I could. The slots are filled. So I signed up recently just to find a few, but it was difficult to find open slots. And this is, especially here in New York, it's sort of an epicenter, so people are sort of even more nervous about things, but people do want to help. And I think a majority of that comes from, because this is such a global crisis where people really know, obviously everyone knows about it and what's happening. There's a sort of communal sense that, for me, just shows when people know that there's a problem and that there's a vulnerable group and that there's something that needs to be helped, they will, and they really want to. So I think the biggest thing, for me at least, has been trying to get the word out as much as possible.
Great. Annie, how about you?
Yeah, no, I agree with Gabriel. I think probably both of us, certainly, and Andrew as well, lots of people we were working with there, quite when we came home, thought, how can we put the word out? And never more so than kind of in the pandemic at the moment, when lots of the news is saturated with everything to do with it. The other point that I think, and this is definitely from being on Lesbos in the camp itself, is people, I agree with Gabe, I think a barrier often is a lack of information, and therefore kind of worry about it. And, worry about yourself, a little bit of guilt, a little bit of kind of low confidence. What could I offer? What could I do? And I think as one person, I think there's not anything one person can do, apart from maybe Andrew. But that's what I think one person can do. I think the wonderful thing about, and the privilege of being there and being on the island and being in the camp, is that you're not alone trying to do something. You're there with many people, many groups trying to do something. And I've seen that, kind of keeping in contact with people who are still there, with lots of different groups. You're exactly right. And with what you said about, you come to terms with, and you kind of plateau at one level of awful or challenge, and work through that. And then something else piles on top of it, like a pandemic. And that can seem overwhelming. And then you do see who you're surrounded by, who you can reach out to. So I know, for example, the medical actors there have joined together. They've made a medical clinic in the camp, where volunteers are now limited because of quarantine rules and travel restrictions. The camp is now, the medical kind of side of the camp is now running on 4 organisations who've joined together. Same with food distributions, as far as I understand, different people are taking different areas of that on. And so I think, a barrier and a hole, I agree, is with Gabe, I think, is information, and also an overwhelming feeling of kind of weight of responsibility. But I think as soon as you can share that by realising there's like-minded people and people willing to go and act, and encouraging people to go and do it, then I think that begins to alleviate some of the pressure and can begin to make solutions.
Andrew, what about you? I'm thinking now of this image that you put in my head about little children living in a homeless state, and if I got it right, they're inhabiting olive groves near Moria camp. I mean, this has got to be both heartbreaking and challenging for you. So what do people need to know? I mean, what gaps exist that would really make life different at Moria camp?
I think it's a challenging question, because I think, unfortunately, we found ourselves in a situation in Moria where, so Moria camp has a sheltering capacity of about 4,000 people. Now this is increased over the years. I think originally the camp was built for 800 people, but they've increased the amount of shelter. However, the underlying infrastructure could not host 4,000 people. So we have some really fundamental issues in Moria, and currently there's 20,000 people there. And because of this, the olive groves surrounding the camp have turned into almost slums or shanty towns. And we're in an unfortunate situation that solutions cannot be found in Moria. There is suffering can be alleviated for individuals there. There is some damage limitation that we can do, but in terms of systematic change within the camp, we need kind of the powers that be to improve our migration policy, and I think we also need governments and leaders to stop kind of spreading information or making us fearful of those who are in incredible need. I mean, primarily what we try to do is we're trying to fulfill some of the obligations that we signed up to in the 50s and 60s in terms of the conventions and the agreements that we put in place, and they're not being upheld. I think going back to what Gabe and Annie were saying, a huge concern, or when I go home, I leave Greece occasionally. I go back to Ireland, or I've been to the States, and I've had to visit my brother down in Australia, and there's a huge lack of first of all engagement or willingness to engage in some of these difficult questions around the most vulnerable in our societies, and that's a huge shame. And not only is it a shame because there are people who are in incredible need, and there are many of us who have incredible privilege, and we can use that to both our advantage and their advantage in terms of offering support. It's also a huge shame for the individuals who don't engage. I came 4 years ago for 3 weeks. I came to volunteer, and I stayed because of how fulfilling the work I did was, how the incredible people I've met, the incredible stories I've heard, the people I've had the opportunity to work with. I mean, some of the most inspirational people I've ever met in my life, I've met in this field. And yeah, it's incredibly fulfilling, and I'm incredibly proud of the work I do, and that's what drives me to continue, is both looking at the people who are in desperate need, but also knowing that I can make a difference, and that this is doing more for my soul than data security ever did. So I do think we need to see more engagement for everyone's sake. We've seen some of the most in our own societies, and both in the US and in Ireland and in Greece, the most vulnerable in our own. I'm not speaking about refugees here. I mean, speaking about the most vulnerable in our own societies, our own communities, people who are low-income earners, or who have health conditions, underlying health conditions, or who are elderly and on their own. They need support, and we have seen with coronavirus, we have seen an engagement that we haven't seen before. And I think a realization that the health and well-being of my neighbor is of great importance to me, and can have a huge impact on my life, as well as theirs. So how can I support them? How can I support them to get groceries so they don't have to put themselves at risk? How, is there anything they may need to get them through the day? And I hope that we see a greater sense of unity here. And again, and that is the solution to Moria. I think, there are 20,000 people in Moria, and we need to see the camp decongested as soon as possible. And that will happen when the, general populace decide that, they are refugees who have been forced to flee their homes. They're, very lovely, very well educated, have a lot to contribute to our societies. And we should not simply just turn our backs and say, well, they're going to take from the government, or, they're going to cause crime, because this is and push those narratives, because they're false. And they create a situation in Moria where we have, hundreds of unaccompanied children homeless, and we have families, and often, we have single mothers with several children, and no access to toilets, or no access to medical care, no access to education. And we leave people in these situations in complete destitution for incredibly long periods of time.
I had a question, because viewers are texting. So how can they get engaged, and through what platform for the viewers? I would like to hear from all of you.
obviously it's incredibly difficult at the moment because we have so many restrictions, and unfortunately the medical and scientific community are saying that, this may be the status quo for quite a long time until we get a vaccine. So I think, going back to what we were saying earlier, the most important thing is beginning to engage at wherever that is. If it's in the local soup kitchen, if it's supporting elderly people who live on their own through different programs to deliver them food, or there are also programs where you just go and spend an hour in conversation with them, with someone who lives on their own and is suffering from loneliness. So I would definitely say look to your local community, because I have met a lot of people who have aspired to support in Greece, or I have a lot of colleagues in Sudan and in the Congo, or in Bangladesh and Lebanon. And, their own personal means don't allow them to go there. They can't get that time off work, or, it can be quite expensive to travel. So I would say, do what you can first and foremost. There are a lot of incredible organizations and incredible projects in every region around the world. I would definitely suggest looking on your own doorstep first and beginning to engage there. And then from there, you'll see an evolution. You'll understand how important it is for those you're serving, but also for your own soul, and then you'll, catch the bug, so to speak. Although, apologies, that may be a very poor.
I would like to add as well. Just I completely agree, and I think it is kind of a way of thinking about things. I agree with what Andrew's saying, is starting in your own home and kind of getting into your soul that way. But also with what Gabriel was saying about allowing yourself to be informed and being inquisitive, and being kind of I've read a very good quote about being an antidote to apathy. So not just letting these things wash over you and being kind of consumed by fear, essentially. I think being the antidote to that kind of apathetic approach, doing what Andrew is saying, being active in your home, being active to seek out information, being active to voice it to other people, and open discussions, I think I would say to those people as well.
Before we close out, Andrew, I just couldn't do his own plug. So if you guys are looking for the sort of quickest way to reach out, is obviously donations. Better Days is his organization. So if you just look them up, it's a great way to sort of get the ball rolling, just because Andrew couldn't plug it himself, but it's an amazing organization. So definitely go check them out.
It's a striking story. And so if I'm going to go back to what the Institute tries to promote, to identify these gaps that you've talked about, the first gap seems to be knowledge that there's need, and the empathy to understand that one can resonate with that need. The second is encouragement that you're not alone, that there are other people who can work with you to try to make this difference that compassion motivates. A third, it seems to me, is a kind of general encouragement of that compassionate motivation, including reaching out to whomever for hope, whether it's the local group that provides food, or whether it's clean water, or whether it's electricity, whether it's shelter, or whether it's a government, or whether it's maybe more generally society that does not value the stories that migrants tell, that camp dwellers tell. So these gaps really begin with understanding what's there, empathizing with it, and having the compassion to try to make a difference. You three have made a difference. There's just no question about it. And what's very interesting is that I bet you never expected this is what you would do with your life. And I bet you also don't know what's going to happen in 10 years, because you're going to continue to evolve and hopefully do so as a result of the need that presents itself, so that you learn about it, that you're empathizing with it, that you're reaching out with compassion to make a difference. And here's the good news: even if it's only one person, and even if it's only one person in an ER in London that you impacted specifically and personally, you're great Each of you is a great success. So congratulations on your amazing successes. We hope you continue those successes because we need you. We need you as role models. We need the Andrews to be our role models. It's safe to go ahead and go to a faraway land. And actually, his motto should be, I came, I saw, I was conquered. Because that's what happened when he went to Greece. He came, he saw, and he had to stay. And he's been there ever since. So thank you all three of you, for being on the program. We're inspired by what you're doing. And we hope we'll stay in touch with you and that we'll be able to meet with you again very soon. Thank you so much for all you do.